Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We will be getting started with our introductions in just a few minutes, so please make yourselves comfortable until then. Before we begin, I'd like to give a quick note about how we'll do Q&A tonight. So for those of you who will join us live in the Zoom webinar, you'll see a control at the bottom of your interface labeled Q&A. You'll be able to use this control to submit typed questions to us, which our panelists will read out for our guests to address. We would ask you to hold your questions until the designated time at the end of the lecture, if you please. Thanks for your understanding on that. Once again, we will get started with introductions in just a moment or two, so please sit tight. Thank you again for your patience, everyone, and thank you for joining us. At this time, I would like to turn things over to Professor Mark Rush, the Director of International Education, and the Stanley D. and Nikki Waxberg Professor of Politics and Law at WNL, to give the introduction for tonight's guest speaker and topic. Mark, you have the spotlight. Please go ahead, sir.
Hi, good evening. It's my pleasure. I have the easiest job tonight. I get to introduce our speaker and to welcome all of you to this evening's talk. Our speaker this evening is Anne-Marie Slaughter. She is CEO of the New America Foundation and the Bert G. Kerstetter 66 University Professor Emerita of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. Dr. Slaughter's CV is extensive and it's just really awe-inspiring just to read it. I will read some of the highlights, but not all of it. Honestly, I could spend the hour just going through all of her accomplishments. From 2009 to 2011, she served as the Director of Policy Planning for the United States Department of State. She was the first woman to hold that position. Prior to that government service, Dr. Slaughter was the Dean of Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs, that is formerly the Woodrow Wilson School, from 2002 to 2009. And she was the J. Sinclair Armstrong Professor of International Foreign and Comparative Law at Harvard Law School from 1994 to 2002. She has written or edited over 7 books. In addition, she is a frequent contributor to a number of publications, including The Atlantic, the Financial Times, the Project Syndicate. In 2012, she published Why Women Still Can't Have It All in The Atlantic, which quickly became one of the most read articles in the history of the magazine and helped spark a renewed national debate on the continued obstacles to genuine full male and female equality. Dr. Slaughter is married to Professor Andrew Miroshchik, and they have 2 sons. The title of tonight's talk is Renewing the Promise of America, Looking Back to Move Forward. It's my pleasure now to turn the podium or the Zoom screen over to Dr. Anne-Marie Slaughter. Thank you. Welcome.
Mark, thank you so much. And I want to begin by saying how happy I am to be virtually with you in Lexington. We've been talking about how odd that is, but I do feel a strong connection to WNL and to Lexington. I grew up in Charlottesville, and indeed my brother and sister-in-law are both graduates of WNL, one of the college, one of the law school. I was just there, and I think my parents are watching just over the mountains. So even though we are actually all in the digital world, that sense of the physical world is certainly with me. I'm also particularly happy to inaugurate this series of lectures. I'm going to talk to you about a book project that I'm very nearly finished with. It will come out next year, and this is really its maiden voyage. in terms of speaking about some of the themes of the book. The book is, and this lecture is about renewing the promise of America, but it does have great bearing on how America should be in the world. And I think a number of the principles that I'll be discussing are equally applicable to other countries. So I hope we can think about this in terms of national and global ethics. I have to start with a little bit of my own story. 3 years ago in 2017, I went through a fairly dramatic professional crisis that ended fairly quickly, but triggered a personal crisis. And I was 59 at the time. For those of you in the audience who are a little older, you will know that turning 60 can do that. To those of you who are younger, you probably can't imagine such an advanced age. But the combination of the two crises led me to a lot of reflection, a lot of hard thought, and particularly a focus on renewal, on the concept of renewal. New America's mission is renewing the promise of America by continuing the quest to hold our nation to its highest ideals. Words that we say all the time, but I hadn't focused specifically on what renewal meant and what it would take. So I'm following in some very distinguished footsteps, although I didn't realize it when I started this project. In 1963, John Gardner, who was a teacher, a writer, a public servant, a leader, he was the head of Common Cause for decades. In 1963, he wrote a book called Self-Renewal, the Individual and the Innovative Society. So he was already talking about personal renewal and national renewal. And it's 1963, so he talked about the dynamism of the space age, but he also talked about, and I'm quoting here, the dry rot produced by apathy, by rigidity, and by moral emptiness. Only the blind and complacent could fail to recognize the great tasks of renewal facing us in government, in education, in race relations, in urban redevelopment, in international affairs, and most of all, in our own minds and hearts. Gardner knew, as I will also insist, that national renewal and personal renewal are inextricably linked. If a society hopes to achieve renewal, he wrote, it will have to produce men and women with the capacity for self-renewal, which he defined as a process of continual learning, growing, and living with purpose and meaning. But renewal actually has many different meanings, and I'm going to give you a couple before we settle in to how we renew the promise of America. Linguist Deborah Fallows, who's the wife of James Fallows, she and Jim spent 3 to 4 years crisscrossing the United States and looking for innovation, optimism, renewal. And Deborah Fallows talks about the tiny community of Eastport, Maine, which had gone through great decline. It never was very big. It was really sort of dying on the vine. So she tells the story of a group of women in Eastport called the Women of the Commons. There's 6 women who decided that they wanted to do something positive to benefit their community. One of the women actually commented on all the D words, DE words, that journalists used in describing Eastport. The most used D words were words like depressed, dependent, decline, despair, and were usually used in comments about economics, services, schools, and population. It just seemed like the D words were ever present, even if the story about Eastport was a positive one. So Deborah Fallows describes how this group, the Women of the Commons, set forth to crowd out the D words with re words, words like rebound, rediscover, redesign, reverse, renew, re-energize, and reemerge. They pushed reporters and politicians to move from D to re, using the more positive words. The tactic worked, at least in the way Eastport was described, and the media stories that use these more positive terms help the community get unstuck. That's one account of one tiny community in Maine where they're using really words, language to change their narrative. Trabian Shorters, who is a leader of the new America that we are becoming, hears the words very differently. He's a former vice president of the Knight Foundation, and he's the CEO of Be Me Community, which is a growing network of African-American leaders and innovators. And the Be Me community and Trabian Shorters have developed a very powerful framework that they call asset framing, where you focus on what people or communities bring to the table as assets rather than their failures. But he says in any crisis, fixers and builders emerge. Fixers, he says, tend to be problem focused. They see the devastation. They're the ones who jump up and rush in and make sure that things get stabilized and things are turned around. You can tend to recognize fixers, he says, because they'll use words like renew, restore, repeal, replace. They're always trying to get things back to some stability, some sense of predictability that they've been used to. Builders, according to Trabian Shorters, have a very different mindset. Builders see that devastation in a crisis as a blank slate. Like whatever the crisis is, whatever is being wiped out, they see it as an opportunity to create something new. Where fixers want to restore an equilibrium, builders are about unbalancing that equilibrium, trying to find a way forward. Builders tend to use words like create, explore, or discover. Much more negative view of renew as looking backwards rather than a positive looking forwards. And finally, for Keith Yamashita, who is he's really an artist, he's an entrepreneur, he's a CEO whisperer in Silicon Valley. He had a stroke at age 51. And now he teaches and indeed preaches the trauma renewal curve, the path from a traumatic experience, illness, loss, failure, cataclysm, through honest self-examination and confrontation to a new and better state. He says after his stroke, he realized that a different way of flourishing might be possible for him. He could aim for post-traumatic growth and live his way into what he calls a renewal. I give you these different definitions because renewal signifies different things for different people. And I will say at the outset, even for those of us who embrace the concept of renewal, it's not enough. There are things that simply need to be destroyed and reconstructed or simply constructed. There are, in our physical world, we're going to have to tear down the strip malls of the 20th century and the endless sprawl of car culture and make room for a far more sustainable 21st century America, probably more community-based. We will have to pull down statues and monuments that many Americans see as honoring treason and racism, and find ways to build new monuments that honor more of who we are as a country. And we've seen some of that with the Peace and Justice Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. We have to be able to reinvent the way we keep our communities safe and healthy and the way we define and defend our national security. I know that many of you in the W&L community are directly involved in these debates. And that is a subject we can certainly take up during question period. I've just gone through something similar in Princeton. But I want to say that I see renewal as a path that is much bolder than reform and yet falls short of revolution. It's a path of what one sociologist has called non-reformist reforms. That basically means really big reforms, not incremental, but big. But its value lies precisely in that it looks backwards and forwards at the same time. Renew. You are taking something that exists and making it new again. That is a concept that allows us simultaneously to take pride in following generation after generation of people who believed in something far better than what they saw around them, who imagined a society that did not exist and dedicated themselves to bringing it about. And at the same time, to face and learn from all the ways that those generations not only failed, but often betrayed the very ideals they professed and fought for. I grew up, as I said, in Charlottesville, not far from you. I grew up going to Monticello. That was the standard school trip in first grade and third grade and fifth grade. I think I could have given you a tour of Monticello from memory. I had been so many times. And of course, we went and we learned all about Jefferson and all the marvelous things he did and the things he invented. And it essentially was a hero's tour. Today, Monticello is a very different place. You still go into this very elegant hall with moose and elk antlers sent back by Lewis and Clark, mounted on the wall. There's a Native American buffalo robe overhanging the balcony, and marble busts of Voltaire and, ironically, Alexander Hamilton flanking the entranceway. This generation will understand that far better than my generation did, why it's ironic that he had Hamilton. People still admire the dumb waiter and the copy desk that Jefferson invented, and the views of the Blue Ridge Mountains will always be there. They hear that Jefferson wanted to be remembered not as president or secretary of state, but as author of the American Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom, and as father of the University of Virginia. But at every turn today, unlike when I was growing up, the tour guides also tell the stories of the enslaved people who made Monticello, and indeed Jefferson's entire career and lifestyle possible. Visitors see reconstructions of the small cabins of Mulberry Row, where those men, women, and children lived and worked, practicing the trades necessary for the plantation to function without payment. Indeed, for those of you who are familiar with the score or the lyrics of Hamilton, you will remember in the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson, Hamilton says, "Hey neighbor, your debts are paid because you don't pay for labor." Visitors hear about Sally Hemings and learn that she and her children, the children Jefferson fathered, remained enslaved during Jefferson's lifetime, although he did free them before or at his death. Many visitors don't like this new approach. They want to venerate Jefferson as the founder and the author of the Declaration of Independence. They want to venerate him and the founding without disturbance or discomfort. As one woman said when hearing about how enslaved people had planted and tended Monticello's gardens, she said, "Why are you talking about all this? You should be talking about the plants." So here's the question. Do we as a nation have the courage to look in the mirror past and see ourselves as honestly as possible in the past and the present? The courage to hear and accept at least some of what others say about us, our fellow citizens and the people of other countries who see us from the outside in. But can we look in that mirror with radical honesty, with unflinching honesty, while at the same time maintaining enough pride and confidence in ourselves to move forward, to renew our ideals and to recommit to being our best selves without hiding from our worst deeds and impulses? And all the while realizing that the we in quotes, must contain multitudes, that Americans must find a way to be pluribus and unum at the same time. And I will come back to that. So renewal requires seeing our past, our present, and our future through different lenses. These are not rose-colored glasses, but they are positive lenses in many ways. And in the time remaining to us, I'm going to outline 5 new lenses for our national self-examination. And perhaps, as they have been for me, for your personal self-examination as well. So the first lens we've just discussed, we have to look back to move forward. We have to look back and reckon with our past and our present with radical honesty. That is the first step toward renewal. And we have just talked about how Monticello does that. It doesn't flinch, but it also does face history in a way that doesn't wipe out the good, but is very, very honest about the bad. So that's the first principle. We have to look back to move forward. The second is quite different. The second lens, a new way of looking at our history and indeed perhaps ourselves, is that we need to understand risk-taking in very different ways. Who does it and what it requires. Much of the American narrative is about taking risks, from the pioneers to the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. Indeed, we see ourselves as an entrepreneurial, risk-acceptant people. But we have a very, very specific concept of how you take risks in this society. You think of the astronauts going to the moon, Neil Armstrong, John Glenn. You think of explorers, Lewis and Clark, who did take plenty of risks. Again, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, it's always about maxing out your credit cards in pursuit of your dream and then gradually building this company, even when you're sleeping, on the floor of your friend's apartment. Or Top Gun, Tom Cruise, and all the test pilot movies. That's the way we think about risk. Often physical risk, something that is death-defying, or if it's not physical, it's at least pushing yourself to your limits. But that's only one perspective on risk. And if you actually look at the literature on risk, you'll see that it's one kind of risk that some people take. It's not even sort of men versus women. It's a particular group of men who take risk in a particular way. Risk-taking is actually not a stable personality trait, even among individuals, much less groups, and certainly not across genders. We have the cliche that women are much less risk acceptant than men. It's not true. Indeed, you even have people who are risk acceptant in some parts of their lives and not in others. So you have gamblers who buy insurance, and you have wallflowers, people who are very shy who go skydiving. So it's not even stable among one person. What does come through in the research is that the risk in a given situation is inherently subjective, varying from one individual to the next. In other words, we look at a proposition. It could be buying a stock. It could be engaging in a risky physical activity. And we weigh the costs and benefits of that particular course of action. But we weigh the costs and benefits based on our personality, but more importantly, our life experiences and our present circumstance. So when men and women have the same perception of the costs and benefits of risk, they are equally likely to take a risk. So if you tell them, do you want to go skydiving? And they look at it and they think, okay, well, here's my chance of dying. And if I die, here are the consequences. They are equally likely to take that risk. But their perceptions often differ, just as the perceptions of men of color or women of color or many different groups differ from the perceptions of cost and benefit from white men. It's not surprising that many women are less willing to take some of the kinds of risks that we point to when we think about risky behavior. Women who are caregivers, for instance, have to assess any potential dangers, not only in terms of a possible threat to themselves, but also to the others who are in their charge. The world is a much scarier place when you are responsible for vulnerable individuals. So the women in these situations aren't actually less daring or less risk acceptance. They're just assessing rightly that the costs of taking that risk are higher than the benefits, a very different calculation than a non-caregiving man might make. And in situations where life experience or other obligations does not shape the perceptions of risk, as I said, then men and women do take risks in equal measure, but they might do so differently. So the financial expert and neuroscientist John Coates has analyzed the behavior of men and women traders. And people always tend to think that male traders are more risk acceptant than women. He says no, that men take risks more quickly. They make the decisions more quickly. Women take longer to make the decision, but in the end, they make the risky decision just as often. So why is it important to think about the different ways of taking risk? It's because we need to look around our society and think about who takes risks very differently than assuming it is just those pioneers, just those explorers, just those entrepreneurs. We actually need to see that risk is equally distributed across the population. But again, who takes it and when is a function of life experience and other obligations. So that then leads us to the third lens, which is that a culture of risk-taking paradoxically requires much more security. Professor Michelle Gelfand, who's a sociologist at the University of Maryland, has done extensive research on what she calls tight versus loose cultures, rule makers versus rule breakers. So tight cultures are very rule bound, very strict, marked by deep social solidarity and conservatism, little room for individual innovation. Think about Japan as a good example. Loose cultures are the opposite. The rules tend to be just the start of a negotiation. Think Italy. Individuals often put themselves apart or ahead of the group, and innovation flourishes. As I said, Italy, Estonia is another good example. Groups that are under threat become much more rule bound. It's not surprising. Think about the military. When your life or death is on the line, that is no time for a negotiation. You get a rule, you get commanded to do something, and you follow that rule, you do what you're told, because your life and the life of the group depends on it. Societies that are less threatened and groups within societies who have more security, who do not feel their very lives or property to be at risk, are, again, somewhat paradoxically, more likely to take other risks. If you have more security, you are more likely to be risk acceptant. This shouldn't actually surprise you, because if you think of the great Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, they are people who could turn to their friends and family to finance their startups. They are people who drop out of prestigious colleges and know that they're going to be okay. They are people who are still on their parents' health insurance. They are taking risks, but they're only going to fall so far. And indeed, when I look back and think about the risks I took about not deciding not to be a lawyer and becoming an academic, I knew that my parents would take me in if they had to, and I knew they had the means to do so. What that means for our society as a whole is that if we really want all Americans to have a shot at that national stereotype of being innovative and risk-taking and brave, we actually have to provide all Americans with the same underlying degree of security, that so they are not afraid for their very lives, for their houses, for their property. A very different way of thinking about how we foster innovation, how we in fact break out of our current stalemates. So that's the third one, that a culture of risk requires much more security. The fourth principle is that independence and individualism require interdependence and solidarity. once again, that independence and individualism, two great American traits, actually require or rest on interdependence and solidarity. So now we need to go back to the myth of rugged individualism, which is a myth for many Americans. So the historian Frederick Jackson Turner presented the thesis of the frontier to an audience at the 1893 Columbia World Exposition in Chicago. And he argued that the individualism of the American character and of American democracy itself was forged by successive waves of hardy pioneers conquering an ever-moving Western frontier. That's 1893. In 1928, Herbert Hoover clarified this thesis of American individualism and the frontier into what he called the American system of rugged individualism. So if you're wondering where rugged individualism comes from, it is Herbert Hoover, and he contrasts this American system of rugged individualism with a European philosophy of diametrically opposed doctrines of socialism and paternalism. On the socialism front, not a lot has changed. This was a political campaign, and one side's being accused of socialism. He develops this idea while he's running for president, and he insists that only through ordered liberty and freedom and equal opportunity will the individual be able to have the initiative and enterprise necessary for the march of progress. So this is, again, this narrative of rugged individualism, of independence, of the person on the frontier. And it comes from the narrative of wagon trains and explorers much of the 19th century, although it even further back, if you look at the Transcendentalists, Emerson is writing about self-reliance. But here's the thing. That narrative is almost entirely limited to white men. If you go back and you read the stories of women who were on the wagon train, in the first place, one of the great chroniclers of this period of history says most of the women didn't want to go. They went because they followed their husbands, but it was their husbands who wanted to strike out for parts unknown. You can imagine in the 19th century, you've got children, you need your community. But of course they go, but their stories are very different. There's one from Martha Smith, who describes her family's move in search of God's country from Missouri to Oklahoma to Texas to Oregon. And she tells, it's really a tough story, unremitting work, homesteading, but she emphasizes not rugged individualism, but community support. She says, we found just about every kind of person in every part of the country. We worked, made friends, helped out where we could, and usually found that others were willing to help us when we had our troubles. We all know the stories of quilting bees and sewing bees and husking bees. A bee is a group of people coming together to help one another. And if you push beyond the white community moving west and look at many of the narratives of African Americans at the same time, the dominant story is the Underground Railroad. And that is not a story of individualism. That is a story of solidarity and interdependence, of people coming together to help one another to be free. Indeed, even again, looking at in the white community, if the very time that Frederick Jackson Turner was talking about the theory of the frontier, Jane Addams, who founded Hull House, not very far from the south side of Chicago, was preaching this doctrine of settlement houses, where she emphasized the need for people to come together in reciprocal relations and common intercourse in building a shared life. And finally, to go back to our transcendentalists, Emerson wrote Self-Reliance. Many of you will have read it in high school. I assure you, you have not read the companion piece by his wife, Lydian Emerson, that is a satire on Emerson and his transcendentalist friends, essentially saying that all their great doctrines of transcendentalism and self-reliance and individualism rested on on her work in taking care of the house and the work of her fellow wives. I don't want to say that there's no individualism in the American character and no innovation, but I do want to say we need both narratives, and we need to recognize how the one depends on the other. We certainly can still talk about independence and individualism, but only if we recognize side by side interdependence and solidarity. The last principle. We can be pluribus and unum at the same time. This is a principle, it's a lens, again, through which to look at our past, our present, and our future. Our motto is e pluribus unum, out of many, one. I want to suggest that really it should be many and one at the same time. The cliched story of pluribus, e pluribus unum is the melting pot. I grew up with the idea of the melting pot. All Americans sort of got swooshed together in this great pot and came out American no matter where our forebears came from. One culture, one set of ideas, holidays, all of that. We moved then from the melting pot to multiculturalism and the wars of the 1990s about many different cultures side by side. Those culture wars are still with us today in the form of debates about identity politics and whether a politics that is based on the identities of many different groups can still have the necessary unity for the nation as a whole. I would suggest this is a false debate. It should be both and. The reason we have this debate is the unum, the out of many one, is again overwhelmingly a not even white male model, a privileged white male model. It's a very narrow part, although an important part of who America is. If you look at who is cited as mainstream, and I do this every time I look at the newspaper, you will see men, white men, largely citing other white men. You'll see women largely citing white men. You don't see a culture in which everyone is recognizing what everyone else brings to the table and contributes. We actually can be both many, and we can be one nation. We can reflect the world. And here it is my great pride as an American to look around my own country and see people from every other culture on earth who are American, but who still retain language or culture or family traditions that have very different roots. So we can reflect the world and still be the United States. And in fact, that very name reflects unity and multiplicity. So I've talked about renewal as a concept that looks backward and forward at the same time, that can face the sins of our past, but not abandon our ideals and some of the great things that actually inspired wave after wave of reformer. I've talked about the different principles or that I think we can use as lenses. Again, the first one, that we have to look back to move forward, that we have to understand risk-taking differently, who does it and how they do it. We have to think that risk-taking requires much more security. Fourth, that independence and individualism require interdependence and solidarity. And fifth, that we can be pluribus and unum at the same time. I want to leave you with a vision of 2026. In 1976, we had the bicentennial of the United States. I was 18. I was graduating from high school in Charlottesville, and I spent the summer manning a bicentennial booth. And indeed, I remember there was an article in the New York Times talking about Jefferson and Charlottesville and Monticello in the bicentennial. And at the end, there was a reference to the fact that there were people who said Jefferson had a number of Black descendants as well as white. 50 years on, as I told you, the history of Monticello has changed dramatically, but it is both and. 2026, our 250th anniversary, will be the anniversary where we are exactly on the hinge from being a white majority nation to becoming a plurality nation. I do not use the term majority minority because the whole point is we won't have minorities if we don't have a majority. We will be a nation of pluralities. And indeed, in 2027, all Americans under 30 will already be a plurality nation. And by 2045, somewhere between 2037 and 2045, we are predicted to be a plurality nation completely. We can take the 5 years between now and 2026 to lay the foundation for celebrating a new America, in many ways a refounded America, a renewed America, but still an America that can look back to the founding of 1776 and take pride in the ideals that were set forth, can accept the hypocrisy of those who set them forth, but who can then trace a history, once again, of all Americans, of good things and bad things, but of a national identity that we can take pride in for the next 250 years. So with that, I will turn it over to questions, and I look forward to the conversation.
Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to invite your questions at this time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom interface. Please submit typed questions there, and Professors Jeremy Weissman and Brian Murchison of the Roger Mudd Center for Ethics will present them to our guest speaker. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think I'll address the first question. So thank you for that wonderful talk. That was extremely informative, very, very interesting. And I was wondering how you saw the sort of view of community support and versus rugged individualism and the need for interdependence and solidarity playing out in an international context. So should we be taking that sort of community-oriented view on an international stage and moving towards more of a cosmopolitanism than we are currently? Or is there room for prioritizing national interests still? So I was wondering your views on that.
It's a great question. Well, the first thing to say is as we become the nation we're becoming, again, a plurality nation in which the white Americans will be the largest plurality, but then probably Latinx Americans and various other groups, we will have a different relationship to the world. I'm half Belgian. The United States has had a very close relationship with Europe because the vast majority of Americans came from Europe, at least initially. And then, of course, more from Asia, and then in the 20th century from Latin America. That means that we will have different family ties, different commercial ties, and we will actually reflect more communal cultures. If you look around the world, Northern European Protestantism is probably the most individualist of cultures in terms of emphasis on family, on community. Certainly you see that in Asia, but you see that in India and African America, in Africa and Latin America. So just as a starting point, our relationship to the world, to the cultures of the world will be different. But your point is your question is, what does that mean for us on the global stage? I still believe that even though we were founded in the name of universal ideals, all men or all humans are created equal, not all Americans, And that should lead to a totally cosmopolitan view. That view is not practical. You really cannot have a nation with open borders, or no one has discovered how you can. I'm not going to say that can't ever happen in the future. So I actually think that for us to be able to stand up for universal principles, we have to take care of those at home first. And I think we've seen this. We're seeing it right now, that Americans do want to do good in the world, but they're not willing to send troops abroad or pour money into other countries when they are not taken care of at home. So indeed, as a foreign policy issue right now, I think the best thing we can do for the world and the best thing we can do for democracy is to repair our own democracy and our own prosperity, and to make our professions of equality far more real than they are today. But I do think an America that does not stand for universal principles is not the America I know or that I want to be part of.
Dr. Slaughter, this is Brian. We have another question. It's a question about item 3 on your list of 5 lenses. The need to promote security to promote more innovation and risk-taking.
Yes.
Is this essentially a call for universal basic income? A recent Canadian study showed that that can work, not perfectly, but still. So how do we develop and manage that universal basic income to promote innovation without the whole thing backfiring?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly a call for universal health care. And a higher threshold of income for most Americans, and really a higher threshold of wealth, because increasingly people who look at the gaps in prosperity see it as an issue of, do you have any wealth? We know the statistics that 40% of Americans can't withstand a $400 emergency expense without getting wiped out. And again, when I think about my own children, my own history, the knowledge that, you can screw up to a certain amount and it's going to be okay is very important in your risk taking. So I do think we've got, for instance, to lower the cost of education, which we certainly can do, and to have real universal health care, but with a far more efficient system. Universal basic income at the level of, say, $1,000 a month, assuming that's affordable, I think is probably very helpful, again, in terms of helping stabilize people's lives. Just to, for instance, to stop the constant eviction and foreclosure, it would make a big difference. I'm not sure we figured out how to do it effectively at a reasonable cost, but I do think as we harness the productivity gains of the ongoing digital revolution, it is quite possible that we will have the means to do that. And again, yes, the paradox is that if you want to see people take risks, you don't give them complete security, but you've got to give them enough security so that they're not clinging to the little they have.
Yeah.
Great. So here's a question from the audience. How do you believe your identity as a white woman has shaped the opportunities and successes you've had in your career?
Well, overall, my status as a white woman has certainly provided me with enormous advantages. I think all of us, or many of us, are starting to understand what it would be to have a skin color that meant you were automatically suspect in many places, or that people assumed you were just not as smart, or not as educated, or you couldn't move into certain neighborhoods. All the ways in which you do see structural racism. It's not that I didn't grow up knowing that there was racism, that there was discrimination. I lived in Virginia in the 60s and the 70s. But I never thought, until I really became very close to an African-American woman, just the difference that in the way she encounters the world, or if she talks to a doctor, they are less likely to believe her. And so medical results, even maternal results for African American women are much higher rate of maternal death than for white women. As a woman, I do understand that more than I think a white man does, because I do know what it's like to be interrupted, to have it be assumed that I'm not as smart, to think when I talk the same amount as a man that I've talked too much, when I behave as a man would as a leader, various nasty words are used, sharp elbows is the nicest. I have certainly experienced, again, not so much individual sexism where a specific man thought I was less than he was. At least in the periods I grew up, I did not encounter much of that. But the structural socialization of men and how they think about women, I have experienced, and it makes it easier for me, I think, to understand what African Americans or Latinx Americans or Americans of color are experiencing. But I will say those two identities pull in different directions. And above all, I was born into an upper middle class family with enough resources to give me a good education, and yes, to be there when I fell, sort of a built-in trampoline. And I do think that's been an enormous gift that I didn't fully appreciate until relatively recently.
Here's another one from the audience. The current polarization is not just dramatically different worldviews, but those views are increasingly based on different acceptances of what are facts. I like the analogy, this question continues, I like the analogy that we can see a river, we can agree there should be a crossing, we can discuss the pros and cons of whether to build a bridge or a tunnel. In today's polarization, there are arguments about whether the river even exists. So how can we move forward with two sets of contradicting facts?
Thank you for the question. And the short answer is that I don't believe we can. When Mayor Bloomberg threw his cap into the ring for the presidential nomination on the Democrat side, a number of people said that he would be far better spending his billions in creating a new news channel that could draw viewers from both sides of the political divide. Because at this point you have Fox News and you have MSNBC, and then CNN is supposedly in the middle, but it isn't really in the middle in terms of its viewership. And I realized recently that if you only watch one or the other, which most of us do not have time to channel surf and watch the same piece of news on different channels, you really are living in a world of different facts, because the media are called the media because they're the intermediary through which we perceive the world. They report the news, what is out there. So if you are getting different news because it's been intermediated by a different and biased source in some direction, then you really do have different facts. And then no, if you can't agree there's a river, you're never going to build a bridge. But we weren't always this way. And indeed, if you look at the history of technology and communications, you will see often periods of a great flowering of many different channels or sources, and then a pruning, and then a great flowering again. I truly believe there is a real market for perhaps it's going to take a group of Democrats and Republicans coming together to support the channel. But it's going to have to take people on both sides of the current divide to say, at every panel, we're not going to have 4 liberals and 1 conservative, or 4 conservatives and 1 liberal. We are really going to report things as fairly as we can, and we're going to have people of different views doing the news gathering and reporting. But it is vital to our democracy.
This next question is, what does 4 more years of a Trump presidency, if he were reelected, do for American global leadership and the direction that democracy and free trade, hallmarks of past American global leadership, would take in the world?
I'm not being political when I say this. It would be absolutely disastrous. I'm trying to present the facts as I see them. Already, many of our allies are turning away because they think we're unreliable. Most of them are just horrified at what is happening, that we are the world's oldest democracy, and we've got, you know, a president who says won't necessarily accept the election results. People are truly worried that we are going to be like so many countries we have seen around the world, where you have a contested election for months, and that can turn into violence. But they're also turning away from us because they think our politics are so broken that you could get a Barack Obama who enters into all these agreements, and then a Trump who tears them all up. And so if the Democrats are reelected and they, you know, conclude new agreements, who's to say that yet once again the cycle won't continue? But Trump really doesn't. He has a very 19th century view of the world. It is a view of great powers who, there are no permanent alliances. It's all transactional. It is who is the most powerful and who can do the biggest deal, who can coerce or otherwise compel the outcome that the nation wants. And that was 19th century great power politics. So effectively, 4 more years will completely undo the post-war international system, or completely undo it as the United States and its allies created it. There's no shortage of nations who will step up. China has its own view of what the international rules should be. Russia has its own view. The EU has a great view, but it doesn't really have the power that the United States and Europe together do. So I really, 4 more years, and I think we do so much damage that there would be no renew or repair. There would be starting over.
Mhm. Here's one more. The struggle for diverse narratives that honor many voices and many cultures is sometimes framed as being against, quote, a grand narrative, unquote. Is there also a new grand narrative that you might be proposing alongside flourishing multicultural narratives?
Yes, I mean, that's such a great question. And Brian, actually, I'd go back to your image, the earlier image of the river, right? The way I see it is there are many, many, many different streams, and many of them are you know, powerful and strong, and they're different narratives and they're different cultures. But I do think that we can write a new grand narrative. It has to be written with much more participation. And that means really hearing what other people are saying. But I'll give you the example of Jill Lepore's history, These Truths, where it's a 1-volume history of the United States. And she really does try to present the bad and the good, or simply the different perspectives at every turn. So she writes about Jamestown. She writes about the first slaves, the enslaved people who arrived at Jamestown and how they saw it. And she writes about the 19th century, and she writes about Native Americans. She really tries to weave it together. And I still think, and I've done a tremendous amount of reading recently of African-American novelists, but also, you know, African-Americans are represented in the military 16%, 3% higher than the percentage of the population, Latinx Americans also. And these are deeply patriotic people who hold to the ideals. And in some ways, they hold to the ideals even when those ideals have let them down far more than they have white Americans. So I still think there is the narrative, and Barack Obama touched on it in his farewell remarks, of a country that holds itself to these ideals, but that is really honest about where and when we fail. But we find purpose and meaning in recognizing, being honest, making reparation where we have to, and then picking ourselves up and striving again. But I do think it's up to all of us to be writing that narrative because we are becoming a different country in many ways. And yet that's really why I'm embarking on this project, the renewal of who we've been, even as we invent ourselves anew.
Right, this next question is in a little bit of a different direction. Can you speak about the process that culminated in Princeton's decision to change the name of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs?
How long do you have? I can, and I have to say I planted that question pretty much in the lecture, and it's very important. And I understand that WNL, of course, is going through a similar, self-examination in terms of your own name. I will start by saying that I graduated from what was then the Woodrow Wilson School in 1980. My father graduated from the Woodrow Wilson School in 1953. We were the first father-daughter combination ever to have graduated. And both of us, I mean, he was an ROTC fellow at Princeton. That's how he got to college. But we were both very drawn to the school and to its mission of public and international affairs. And then, of course, I was dean. So I say all that because actually, the Woodrow Wilson School meant a lot to me. And I grew up in Charlottesville, and Wilson is from Stanton. And also as an internationalist, I do believe in Wilson's ideals. Again, he was racist, although with respect to Asians, he actually tried to kind of leave room in the settlement of Versailles for a universal vision. And I've read a lot about him. I don't particularly like him as a person, but there's a great deal that he did that was good. So coming into all of this, in 2016, I supported the trustees' recommendation that we not change the name of the school, but that we put up a sculpture that is called Double Sights, that presents, just as I have here, the good and the bad side by side. It has some of Wilson's soaring rhetoric, some of his proud accomplishments as a progressive, the income tax, trust busting, wage and hour legislation, the international vision he had. And then on the other side of this sculpture are quotes from African Americans and women and others at the time. And earlier this summer, probably a week after George Floyd was murdered, I was looking at this sculpture and I was reading a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote, of course, The Souls of Black Folk, who was a great sociologist. And he wrote a paragraph to Wilson in 2013 that said, "Mr. President, all my people ask is a chance to lead our lives in safety and prosperity." And I looked at that and I thought, that was 1913. We're in 2020, and you could still be asking, many African-American leaders are asking that same question. And for me, then it became a question not so much of what I was giving up, but of the statement that we are prepared to change, that something has to give, that we can't just keep doing the same thing, hoping that somehow it's going to fix the problem, because it isn't. From that starting point, changing the name of the school is clearly just a symbol, but it's a very important symbol to the African-American alumni of Princeton, to the students, and critically, and this is the other reason I think that the board changed its mind, and it was a unanimous board decision, and Princeton board has people from all across the political spectrum and many other places. If the school is to be the great school of public and international affairs that Woodrow Wilson would have wanted it to be, it started out actually as a school of public and international affairs, was named for him 12 years later when Mrs. Wilson was satisfied it was good enough to bear his name. But he would have wanted that school to be world class. And we are not going to be able to get the talent that we want to educate the students we want if we continue to insist that they come to a school bearing the name of someone who resegregated the federal service and who said that he essentially thought, he thought blacks were inferior. You can say that's bad and there's other good, but that's a fact. And so in the end, to me, it is about the need to demonstrate that we are truly open to change, and the need to recognize that as power shifts in our society, and it will, we have to recognize the perspectives of many others. And if Princeton had been run by African Americans from the beginning, they never would have named it the Woodrow Wilson School. So it wasn't easy. Not everyone, even in my family, agrees with that decision, but I think it was courageous. And I think it is what will help keep Princeton a great university in this century. You're on mute, Professor Murchison.
Thank you. I see one more. Are you familiar with Strauss and Howe's fourth turning about cycles of history? Wouldn't you agree we are now in a fourth turning, and who is elected will make a huge difference in the next first cycle narrative? What forms the next culture and social mores?
So I have not actually read Strauss and Howe. I have read about them. So I really can't speak to the theory itself.
Yeah.
I do think that we are at a hinge moment in our history. I mean, I ended by talking about 2026 as a hinge, but really, certainly this century, if you take 2001 and you look at the changing demography, which was actually set in the 1990s, but also the technology, the way, look at us right now. It would have seemed like magic, probably even 5 years ago, that we could be all talking to one another on a screen like this. And we're going through technological and social change of earth-shaking magnitude. And so that does mean we have to renew the country. And I do think the person who is elected will either call us together and try to write that common narrative and try to help us find that people who voted differently than we did are still loving parents and church members and, pillars of their community. And, that there are things that divide us, but there are many things that unite us. That president can then lay the foundation for the huge common work we have to do together. If we don't, if we are still deliberately divided by our media, but also by our leaders, I truly then think that we will look back, historians will look back a little like the Roman Empire and say, it had everything going for it, but it rotted from within. And I truly, truly hope that's not the case. I believe it doesn't have to be the case. And I certainly, and as many, many Americans, I think, are going to dedicate ourselves to ensuring that it isn't the case.
Thank you. I'll send this back up to Mark.
Okay, I didn't realize that this was coming back to me, but I'm happy to have a wonderful hour with you. I hope our audience could. I wish our audience could express my thanks less virtually, but on behalf of the university, on behalf of the Mudd Center, on behalf of the Center for International Education, thank you so much for a fantastic evening.
You're welcome. It's been such a pleasure.